The autumn rain fell like needles against the cobblestones of Moonstone territory, each drop carrying the weight of 1,000 whispered prayers from wolves who had learned to bow before power. Lara Winters stood at the edge of the ceremonial grounds, her thin frame barely visible beneath the oversized coat that hung from her shoulders like a shroud. The fabric was worn at the elbows, frayed at the hem, speaking volumes about the journey that had brought her to this moment. Her wolf stirred, restlessly beneath her skin, a presence so faint that even she sometimes questioned its existence. Around her, the gathered members of the Moonstone pack radiated auras that painted the air in shades of amber and crimson, visible manifestations of their strength that danced like aurora borealis above their heads. Lara's own aura was barely a whisper, a pale flickering thing that might have been mistaken for moonlight on water, or the dying embers of a forgotten fire. Alpha Caden Blackthorn stood upon the raised stone platform that had witnessed centuries of pack ceremonies, his presence commanding the space with the inevitability of a thunderstorm. He was a monument to lupine perfection, standing well over 6 feet with shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of his brutal reputation. His aura blazed around him like liquid gold, threaded with streaks of violent red, so potent that lesser wolves had to avert their eyes or risk being overwhelmed by the sheer force of his dominance. His jaw was carved from granite, his eyes the color of storm clouds before lightning strikes, and when he moved, it was with the predatory grace of a creature that had never known defeat. The scars that decorated his forearms were not marks of vulnerability, but trophies, each one a story of survival and conquest that had built his legend across the continental packs. The ceremony had drawn wolves from neighboring territories, all curious to witness the arrival of new members to the most powerful pack in the northern regions. Caden's beta, Marcus, stood to his right, a solid presence with calculating eyes that missed nothing. To his left, the pack's head warrior, a scarred woman named Vera, watched the proceedings with the detached interest of someone who had seen too many ceremonies to be moved by another. The air thrummed with anticipation as Caden's gaze swept across the assembled newcomers. 7 wolves who had petitioned for acceptance into Moonstone's ranks. 6 of them stood tall, their auras respectable demonstrations of capability that earned approving nods from the gathered pack members. Then, Caden's eyes landed on Lara. The silence that followed was so complete that the rain itself seemed to pause in respect for what was about to unfold. Caden descended from the platform with deliberate slowness, each step calculated to maximize the psychological impact of his approach. When he reached Lara, he circled her like a shark scenting blood and water, his nostrils flaring as he attempted to catch the scent of her wolf. His expression shifted from curiosity to confusion to something far more dangerous, a contempt so pure it seemed to lower the temperature around them. When he finally spoke, his voice carried across the grounds with the resonance of someone who had never been denied, each word precisely chosen to inflict maximum humiliation. This is what crawls to my doorstep seeking sanctuary? This pathetic excuse for a wolf whose aura is so weak I could mistake her for a human playing dress-up? Tell me, little mouse, did you wander into the wrong gathering? Perhaps you meant to find the community theater down the road where they appreciate performances of mediocrity. The gathered wolves erupted in laughter, the sound rolling across the grounds like thunder. Lara felt each chuckle like a physical blow, her fingers curling into fists at her sides as she fought to maintain composure. Caden leaned closer, his breath hot against her ear as he whispered loud, enough for the front rows to hear. In my pack, we have standards. We do not accept charity cases or broken things that will only drag down our collective strength. Whatever tragedy befell your previous pack to make them reject you, I can see they made the right choice. Lara's wolf whimpered inside her, a sound of pain that reverberated through her chest like a bell tolling for the dead. She had expected coldness, perhaps skepticism, but this level of public degradation was a cruelty she had not anticipated. Her previous pack had cast her out not for weakness, but for something they feared, something they could not name but sensed, lurking beneath her unremarkable surface. The elders had whispered about ill omens and dangerous bloodlines, their fear disguised as concern for pack safety. She had hoped that distance would grant her a fresh start, that perhaps in Moonstone territory she might find wolves secure enough in their own power to overlook her peculiarities. Instead, she had found an alpha whose ego was so bloated that he needed to crush others simply to remind the world of his dominance. If you're enjoying this story of hidden power and inevitable reckoning, make sure to hit that like button and let me know in the comments what you think Lara's true nature might be. Subscribe so you don't miss what happens when the truth finally breaks free. Caden straightened, addressing the crowd with the theatrical flair of someone performing for an audience he knew would applaud regardless of merit. Since the moon goddess, in her infinite and sometimes questionable wisdom, has seen fit to deliver this creature to our borders, and since I am known for my generosity, I will allow her to remain, not as a member with full rights and privileges, but as a worker. She will serve in the kitchens, clean the training grounds, and perform whatever menial tasks my pack requires. Perhaps through hard labor and observation of true wolves, she might develop some semblance of worth. Or perhaps she will simply confirm what we all can plainly see, that some bloodlines are destined to serve while others are born to rule. The ceremony continued with the acceptance of the other 6 newcomers, each receiving the traditional welcome and the pack's blessing. Lara was shuffled to the side, forgotten in the celebration that followed, a ghost at a feast she had not been invited to attend. As the crowd dispersed, and rain began to fall again in earnest, she found herself standing alone in the emptying grounds, her clothes soaked through, and her pride shattered into fragments too small to gather. A young wolf, barely past his first shift, approached with something that might have been pity in his eyes. He handed her a rough map to the Omega quarters and mumbled directions to the kitchen where she was expected before dawn. His kindness, small as it was, felt like a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. The Omega quarters were exactly what she had expected, converted storage building at the far edge of Packlands, where the rejected and powerless made their homes. The room assigned to her was barely large enough for the narrow bed and battered dresser that constituted its furnishings. Water stains bloomed across the ceiling like dark flowers, and the window refused to close completely, allowing cold air to whistle through the gap. Lara sat on the bed, springs creaking in protest beneath her weight, and allowed herself exactly 5 minutes to cry. 5 minutes to mourn the hope she had carried across 3 states and countless miles. 5 minutes to feel the full weight of her isolation and the cruel hand fate had dealt her. Then she dried her eyes, unpacked her meager belongings, and began to prepare for the role she would play until circumstance or courage allowed her to do otherwise. The weeks that followed established a brutal routine that ground down any remaining optimism Lara might have harbored. She woke before dawn to prepare breakfast for the pack's warriors, her hands moving through the familiar motions of cooking, even as her mind drifted to places far from the industrial kitchen that had become her prison. Caden made a habit of appearing during meals, his presence a dark cloud that cast shadows across even the brightest moments. He seemed to take particular pleasure in finding fault with her work, criticizing the temperature of the coffee, the seasoning of the meat, the arrangement of plates on the serving line. His comments were always delivered with that same casual cruelty, as if her humiliation was so beneath his notice that he could dispense it without thought or consequence. The other Omegas, broken souls who had long since accepted their place at the bottom of the hierarchy, warned her to keep her head down and her mouth shut. They shared stories in whispered voices about wolves who had challenged Caden's authority and disappeared into the wilderness, their fates unknown but easily imagined. The pack operated under a system of absolute dominance where questioning the alpha was tantamount to suicide, and Caden had cultivated an environment where fear and respect had become indistinguishable. His inner circle consisted of wolves who had proven their loyalty through acts of violence and intimidation, each one eager to curry favor with a leader whose approval meant power and whose displeasure meant destruction. Yet beneath the surface of Moonstone's apparent strength, Lara began to notice fractures. The way warriors flinched when Caden entered a room spoke not of respect, but of trauma. The silence that fell over conversations when his name was mentioned carried the weight of unspoken resentments and suppressed rage. She observed how pack members avoided eye contact with him, how they measured their words with the precision of people walking through a minefield. This was not a pack united by loyalty, but one held together by terror. a distinction that made all the difference in the day. World. 3 months into her tenure as Moonstone's most despised Omega, an incident occurred that would set in motion the events that would eventually shatter everything Caden had built. A young pup, no more than 7 years old, had been orphaned when his parents died defending the northern border from rogues. The boy, whose name was Thomas, had no living relatives within the pack, and no one willing to take responsibility for raising him. Caden, demonstrating the compassion of a glacier, declared that the pup would earn his keep by working in the stables, cleaning stalls, and hauling feed, despite hands barely large enough to grip a pitchfork. When Thomas made the mistake of spilling a bucket of water near Caden's prized stallion, the alpha's response was swift and merciless. Lara had been crossing the courtyard with an armload of linens when she heard the child scream. The sound cut through her like a blade, primal and terrified in a way that transcended species. She dropped the linens without thought, running toward the stables with a speed that surprised even her weakened wolf. What she found made her blood turn to ice in her veins. Caden had Thomas suspended in the air by one arm, the child's shoulder clearly dislocated as he dangled like a broken puppet. The alpha's face was contorted with rage over something so trivial it barely registered as an inconvenience, his control so absolute that no one in the gathered crowd dared to intervene. Let this be a lesson. About the cost of incompetence, Caden snarled, shaking the child like a rag doll. In my pack, even pups are expected to demonstrate basic capability, since you cannot manage simple tasks without destroying valuable property. Perhaps pain will teach you what words apparently cannot. Thomas's sobs had devolved into whimpers, the sound of a spirit breaking in real time. The wolves watching from the stable doors wore expressions ranging from horror to resignation, all of them trapped in the same calculus of self-preservation that had allowed Caden's tyranny to flourish unchecked. Something inside Lara snapped. It was not a conscious decision, but rather an instinct so deep and primal that it bypassed rational thought entirely. She felt heat building in her chest, spreading through her limbs like wildfire consuming dry tinder. Her vision sharpened until she could see individual dust motes suspended in shafts of sunlight, could count the heartbeats of every wolf present, could feel the pulse of the earth beneath her feet, connecting her to something vast and ancient that had been sleeping inside her since birth. When she spoke, her voice carried a resonance that made every wolf present freeze, their instincts recognizing a threat that their conscious minds could not yet name. Put him down. The words emerged not as a request, but as a command, each syllable weighted with authority that had no business coming from an Omega's throat. Caden turned slowly, his expression shifting, from surprise to amusement, to something approaching rage as he registered who had dared to speak. He dropped Thomas carelessly, the boy crumpling to the stable floor as Caden advanced on Lara with murderous intent, clear in every line of his body. The crowd pressed backward, giving them space for a confrontation that could only end in bloodshed. Did the little mouse just squeak at me? Did the weakest creature in my territory just presume to give me orders? Caden's laugh was ugly, devoid of humor, the sound of a predator playing with prey before the kill. I should rip your throat out for such insolence. I should make an example of you that will remind every Omega in this pack what happens when they forget their place. He closed the distance between them in 3 long strides, one hand reaching for her throat, with fingers that had ended more lives than Lara could count. The moment his skin made contact with hers, the world exploded. The sensation started as a tingling in her extremities, a pins and needles feeling that intensified with every passing second, until it felt like her entire body was composed of lightning-given flesh. Her aura, that pathetic flickering thing that had been her shame, and Caden's ammunition, suddenly blazed to life with the intensity of a supernova. The pale shimmer transformed into a pillar of silver-white light that shot skyward, punching through the stable roof and continuing upward until it seemed to pierce the heavens themselves. The sawing. Temperature dropped so rapidly that frost formed on the ground despite the autumn warmth, and the horses in their stalls screamed in panic as ancient instincts recognized the presence of something that transcended their understanding of natural order. Caden stumbled backward, his hand smoking where it had touched her skin, his aura flickering and dimming like a candle in a hurricane. For the first time in his adult life, genuine fear crossed his features as he watched Lara transform before his eyes. Her body lifted off the ground, suspended by invisible forces as her spine arched and her head fell back. Her eyes, normally a plain brown, blazed with silver fire that cast dancing shadows across the stable walls. The pack bond, that invisible thread that connected every moonstone wolf to their alpha, began to fray and snap like overstressed rope, causing wolves throughout the territory to cry out in confusion and pain. Then the sky split open. Not metaphorically, not as some poetic exaggeration, but literally and impossibly. A jagged tear appeared in the fabric of reality directly above the moonstone compound. Through the rift, otherworldly light spilled into the mortal realm, colors that had no names in human languages painting the clouds in shades of celestial beauty. The sound that accompanied the phenomenon was like nothing anyone present had experienced, a harmonic resonance that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, carrying within it the whispers of a million voices singing in languages dead for millennia. Ancient symbols began to materialize in the air around Lara, glowing runes that rotated slowly like planets orbiting a star. Pack historians who witnessed the event would later identify them as Old Tongue, the written language of the celestial wolves, a bloodline believed extinct for over 1,000 years. The Celestials had been the original wolves, creatures born when the moon goddess first decided to bless mortals with her power. They served as intermediaries between the divine and mundane worlds, judges who ensured that alpha power was used justly and that pack law remained aligned with celestial will. When they vanished during the Great Purge, a dark period of lupine history shrouded in mystery and deliberate historical erasure, the balance between the worlds had begun its slow collapse. The light emanating from Lara intensified, until watching it directly became impossible, forcing even Caden to shield his eyes. When the brilliance finally dimmed enough to permit vision, the transformation was complete. Lara stood on solid ground once more. But the meek Omega who had shuffled through the pack accepting abuse had been replaced by something altogether different. She had grown several inches taller, her frame now wrapped in lean muscle that spoke of strength beyond mere physical capability. Her hair, previously a mousy brown, had transformed into silver white that seemed to hold starlight within each strand. Most striking were her eyes, no longer brown but purest silver, reflecting light like polished mirrors, and seeing far more than ordinary wolves could comprehend. Her voice, when she finally spoke, carried harmonics that resonated in the bones of every listener. I am Lara Winters, last daughter of the celestial line, keeper of the old ways, and bearer of the Aurora's judgment. For 1,000 years, my bloodline has slept, waiting for the age when alphas would grow so drunk on their own power that they forgot the sacred purpose for which dominance was granted. That age has come. That reckoning begins now. She raised one hand, and Thomas, still crumpled on the stable floor, began to glow with gentle silver light. His dislocated shoulder snapped back into place with a sound like a branch breaking in reverse, his bruises fading as celestial energy knitted torn tissue and soothed traumatized nerves. Within seconds, the boy was whole again, staring up at Lara with an expression of awe that bordered on religious fervor. Caden recovered his composure with visible effort, his alpha pride warring with survival instinct, as he assessed this new threat. I don't care what fancy light show you can produce, or what delusions of grandeur your bloodline has filled your head with. This is my territory, my pack, and my law. You are an Omega who has overstayed her welcome, and I will deal with you, as I deal with all who challenge my authority. He began to shift, his human form melting into the massive black wolf that had terrorized battlefields and broken enemy packs. His beast stood nearly 5 feet at the shoulder, a monster of fur and fang that radiated killing, intent like heat from a furnace. Lara did not shift to meet his challenge. Instead, she simply looked at him, and in that gaze, Caden saw his entire life laid bare. Every act of cruelty, every unnecessary violence, every moment he had chosen fear over compassion and domination over justice. All of it reflected back at him through eyes that judged without malice, but with absolute certainty. She extended her hand toward him. An invisible force seized his wolf, lifting the massive beast off the ground as easily as Caden himself had lifted Thomas. The alpha struggled, his powerful legs churning air as he fought against restraints he could not see or break. You have spent your life believing that might makes right, that the strong are entitled to abuse the weak, that power is its own justification, Lara said, her voice sad, rather than angry, disappointed rather than vengeful. You have built an empire on fear and called it leadership. You have broken spirits and called it discipline. You have tortured children and called it teaching. All of this you have done while believing yourself untouchable, consequence exempt because no wolf in the mortal realm possessed the strength to challenge you. But I am not of the mortal realm alone, Caden Blackthorn. I am the consequence that comes when alphas forget they were meant to be guardians, not tyrants. She closed her fist, and Caden's wolf form began to compress, the change forced upon him in reverse. He materialized back in human form, naked and gasping, his body hitting the ground with force that drove the air from his lungs. The pack bond, already frayed, disintegrated completely, severing the connection between alpha and subordinates. The sensation was agonizing, like having part of his soul ripped away, leaving behind a hollowness that threatened to consume him. Around the compound, Moonstone wolves collapsed as they felt the bond break. Centuries of tradition and instinct suddenly silent, where there had always been the comforting presence of pack connection. Are you watching with your jaw on the floor right now? Drop a comment telling me what you think should happen to Caden. Does he deserve mercy or justice? And don't forget to subscribe because this story is about to get even more intense. Lara approached the fallen alpha, her footsteps soundless despite the stable's dirt floor. I am going to give you something you have never given another living soul, Caden Blackthorn. I am going to give you a choice. You can die here, today. Your legacy nothing more than a cautionary tale about pride and cruelty. Or you can live and learn what it truly means to be worthy of the power you have wielded so carelessly. You can begin the long, painful process of becoming the alpha you should have been from the beginning. She knelt beside him, one hand hovering over his chest where his heart hammered like a trapped bird. But understand this. If you choose life and redemption, there is no halfway. You will face every wolf you have harmed. You will answer for every act of tyranny. You will rebuild this pack from its foundation, and you will do it under my observation. Fall back into old patterns, retreat into the comfort of intimidation and fear, and I will finish what I began today. Choose. Caden stared up at her. Pride and pragmatism engaged in brutal warfare across his features. His entire identity was constructed around being the strongest, the most feared, the unchallengeable apex predator. To accept her terms would be to admit that everything he had believed about himself and power was fundamentally wrong. But the alternative was death, and whatever else he might be. Caden Blackthorn was a survivor. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse, stripped of its usual arrogance. I choose to live. I choose to learn. I choose redemption, though I do not deserve it and cannot imagine earning it. Lara nodded, her expression unreadable. Then we begin. She stood, addressing the assembled wolves who had watched this entire exchange in stunned silence. The Moonstone Pack as you knew it is dissolved. The old hierarchy, built on intimidation and maintained through fear, ends today. We will rebuild according to the old ways, where alphas earn their position through service rather than conquest, where strength is measured by what you protect rather than what you destroy. Those who cannot accept this change are free to leave. Those who remain do so knowing that cruelty will no longer be tolerated, that abuse will be answered with exile, and that every wolf, regardless of status or bloodline, will be treated with the dignity they deserve as children of the moon goddess. The days that followed the awakening were chaos barely contained by Lara's newfound authority. News of what had occurred in the Moonstone stables spread across the continental packs with the speed of wildfire, growing more fantastical with each retelling. Some versions claimed Lara had torn the Alpha's throat out and seized power through conquest. Others insisted she was a witch who had placed Caden under a curse. A few, closer to the truth but still missing crucial details, whispered about the return of the celestial bloodline and what that might mean for Alphas who had grown comfortable in their unchecked power. The Alpha Council, a governing body composed of the 10 most powerful pack leaders in North America, called an emergency session to address the Moonstone situation. They viewed Lara's emergence and her dissolution of pack bonds as an existential threat to the established order. If one Omega could rise up and unmake an Alpha, what prevented others from attempting the same? The carefully constructed hierarchy that had governed Lupine society for generations suddenly seemed fragile, built on foundations of consent that could be withdrawn if the ruled decided their rulers were unworthy. Several council members advocated for immediate military action, arguing that Lara should be captured or killed before her revolution spread to other territories. Caden, stripped of his pack bond and therefore his Alpha authority, found himself in a position he had never imagined possible. Powerless. The wolves who had once scrambled to obey his every whim now looked through him as if he were a ghost, their loyalty revealed as nothing more than fear of consequences that no longer existed. He moved through the compound like a man navigating a foreign country, everything familiar yet transformed by his altered perspective. Lara had assigned him quarters in the Omega Wing, a deliberate choice that forced him to experience firsthand the conditions he had created for those he deemed beneath him. The thin walls that provided no privacy, the inadequate heating that made winter nights an ordeal, the pervasive sense of being forgotten and dismissed, all of it became his daily reality. She also assigned him a task that was both punishment and therapy. He would personally apologize to every wolf he had wronged during his tenure as Alpha. Not generic statements of regret delivered from a position of safety, but face-to-face conversations where he would articulate exactly what he had done wrong and how his actions had caused harm. The process was excruciating, forcing him to confront the wake of trauma he had left behind, warriors who flinched at his approach, Omegas who could not meet his eyes without experiencing flashbacks, parents whose children had learned to fear authority because Caden had modeled cruelty as leadership. Each conversation was a small death, an execution of the ego he had spent decades constructing. Lara, meanwhile, struggled with her own transformation. The power that had awakened within her was vast and largely uncontrolled, responding to her emotions in ways that were sometimes helpful and occasionally terrifying. When she grew angry, electronics malfunctioned and light bulbs exploded. When she felt sorrow, plants in her vicinity withered and died. She spent hours in meditation, reaching into the genetic memory stored within her celestial bloodline, accessing knowledge from ancestors who had wielded this power with grace and precision. The learning curve was steep and the stakes immense, for one mistake could kill someone she meant to protect or destroy something she meant to preserve. She also discovered that her transformation had made her a beacon for supernatural forces that had remained dormant or hidden for centuries. Ancient creatures began appearing at Moonstone's borders, drawn by the celestial energy that emanated from Lara like heat from a star. Some came with offers of alliance, recognizing in her the return of an old order they had long supported. Others arrived with hostile intent, viewing her existence as a threat to Mao, their own plans and agendas. A vampire coven from the Eastern Territories sent an emissary proposing a treaty that would bind Moonstone wolves to their service in exchange for protection from the Alpha Council. A Fey Court representative offered knowledge and training if Lara would agree to owe them a future favor, the terms of which would be determined at their discretion. She refused both, understanding that accepting outside help always came with strings that could strangle you when pulled taut. The Alpha Council's response arrived on the 6th day after Lara's awakening. A delegation of 5 Alphas, each commanding packs of over 200 wolves, appeared at Moonstone's borders demanding an audience. They were led by Alpha Damian Frost, ruler of the Northwind Pack, and the Council's chairman, a wolf whose reputation for strategic brilliance was matched only by his ruthless pragmatism. The delegation was heavily armed and accompanied by enough warriors to constitute an invasion force, their message clear through both their words and their weapons. Submit to council authority or be destroyed. Lara met them at the border, alone and apparently unarmed, her silver hair catching sunlight like a banner. Damien approached with the confidence of someone accustomed to intimidating others through sheer presence. He was an impressive figure, older than Caden by at least 2 decades, but carrying his years with the grace of a wolf in his prime. His eyes were chips of blue ice, calculating and cold, assessing Lara with the intensity of a general surveying a battlefield. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of centuries of alpha authority. Lara Winters, you stand accused of destroying a sanctioned pact bond, usurping legitimate alpha authority, and threatening the stability of the continental supernatural order. The Alpha Council demands you submit to our custody for trial. Refuse, and we will take you by force and execute you as a rogue threat to Lupine. Society. Lara smiled, and there was nothing human in the expression. Alpha Damien Frost, you stand before the last daughter of the celestial line making demands as if you possess the authority to compel my obedience. You do not. The Alpha Council exists at the pleasure of the moon goddess and has authority only insofar as it serves her purpose. When that purpose is corrupted, when alphas rule through fear rather than service, when power becomes its own justification divorced from responsibility, the Celestials are awakened to restore balance. I did not destroy Moonstone's pact bond. I severed a chain that bound wolves to a tyrant. I did not usurp Caden Blackthorn's authority. I removed power from someone wielding it in ways that violated every principle upon which alpha leadership was founded. And I have not threatened your precious order. I have revealed it for what it truly is, a structure designed to protect those at the top from accountability for their crimes, against those beneath them. The tension in that moment was a physical thing, pressing down on everyone present, like atmospheric pressure before a storm. Damien's warriors shifted nervously, their hands moving toward weapons as they felt the power emanating from Lara intensify. The Alpha himself remained motionless, but his aura flickered and pulsed as he wrestled with instincts that screamed contradictory commands. Attack the threat, submit to superior power, flee before destruction comes. His pride won out over survival instinct, a decision he would later recognize as potentially fatal. If you will not come peacefully, then you leave us no choice. He gestured, and his warriors surged forward, 20 elite fighters moving with the coordinated precision of wolves who had trained together for years. Lara raised both hands, and the world stopped. Not metaphorically, not as exaggeration, but literally and impossibly. Time itself seemed to freeze within a 100-foot radius of where she stood. The attacking wolves became statues mid-leap, their expressions locked in fierce determination, their claws extended toward targets they would never reach. Only Damien remained mobile, protected from the temporal effect by some quality of his alpha nature that granted him resistance to direct manipulation. He stared at his frozen warriors, genuine fear finally cracking the facade of confidence he had maintained. I am trying very hard not to kill anyone today, Lara said, and her voice carried the weariness of someone bearing a burden they never asked for. I do not want to be your enemy, Alpha Frost. I do not want to dismantle the Council or throw Lupine society into chaos. But I will not allow this corruption to continue unchallenged. Caden Blackthorn was a symptom of a disease that has infected alpha culture for generations. You know this is true. You have attended council meetings where alphas bragged about their brutality. You have heard stories of omegas driven to suicide by systematic abuse. You have watched as dissenters disappeared, and inconvenient truths were buried beneath official denials. You have permitted all of this because challenging it would have required you to sacrifice your own position and power. She lowered her hands, and time resumed its normal flow. The warriors crashed to the ground, their momentum carrying them forward into undignified heaps of confused and disoriented wolves. Damien helped his beta to her feet, his movements slow and careful, a predator recognizing that he had stumbled into the territory of something far more dangerous than he had anticipated. When he looked at Lara again, the calculation in his eyes had shifted from, how do I defeat her, to how do I survive this encounter? It was progress, albeit progress born from fear rather than genuine understanding. What do you want? Damien asked. and the question carried the weight of genuine curiosity rather than tactical maneuvering. If your goal is not destruction or domination, if you truly seek to reform rather than replace, then tell me plainly what you expect from the Alpha Council and from alphas like myself who have built their lives within the current structure. It was perhaps the most honest question he had asked in decades, stripped of political posturing and strategic obfuscation. Lara considered her response carefully, aware that her next words would shape not only this conversation, but potentially the future of lupine governance across the continent. I want alphas to remember that their power is a gift, not a right. That dominance carries with it the responsibility to protect and nurture those under your authority, not exploit them for your own gratification. I want pack bonds to be built on genuine loyalty and mutual respect, rather than fear and coercion. I want omegas and subordinate wolves to have recourse when their alphas abuse power, some mechanism for accountability that does not require them to risk their lives, challenging someone who could destroy them without consequence. I want the Alpha Council to become what it was meant to be, a body that ensures justice and maintains balance, rather than a club for tyrants to legitimize each other's crimes. She paused, letting the words settle. And I want all of this to happen through reform and education, rather than through violence and revolution. But I will accept violence if that is the only language you speak. The standoff continued for another hour, Damien negotiating terms with the caution of someone defusing a bomb, while Lara remained firm on her core principles, but flexible on implementation details. Eventually, they reached an agreement that satisfied neither party completely, but gave both enough to justify backing down from immediate conflict. The Alpha Council would establish a committee to review complaints against alphas and investigate allegations of abuse. Lara would serve on this committee along with representatives from various pack levels, ensuring that Omega voices would be heard alongside alpha interests. In exchange, she would not actively interfere with pack governance outside of cases involving severe abuse or threat to life. It was a compromise that left everyone slightly unsatisfied, which paradoxically made it a fair deal. As the council delegation departed, Damien paused at the border for a final exchange. You realize that some alphas will never accept this, that there are wolves whose entire identity is constructed around domination and who will view your reforms as existential threats to be eliminated at any cost. You have painted a target on yourself that will attract every violent, power-hungry alpha on the continent. They will come for you, Lara Winters, and they will not negotiate or compromise. They will simply try to kill you and everyone you care about. There was no satisfaction in his warning, only a grim acknowledgement of reality. Lara nodded, accepting the truth of his prediction, without flinching from it. Then I will deal with them as they come, and perhaps each one who falls will serve as a lesson to the others about the true cost of clinging to tyranny. Change is never easy, Alpha Frost. It is never clean or bloodless, but it is necessary, and I will see it through regardless of what it costs me personally. She turned to walk back toward the compound, then paused. You were not always the calculating politician you have become. There was a time when you believed in ideals beyond mere survival and advancement. Find that wolf again, Damien Frost. He will be needed in the days ahead. The months that followed tested everyone involved in ways they could not have anticipated. Caden's journey toward redemption proved far more complicated than simply apologizing and changing behavior. Years of conditioning himself to view compassion as weakness and empathy as vulnerability had to be unlearned, a process that felt like ripping out his own foundation and rebuilding. From rubble, he discovered that many of the wolves he had harmed were not interested in forgiveness, that some wounds cut too deep to heal with mere words. A warrior named James, whose mate Caden had executed for perceived insubordination years ago, spit in his face during their mandated conversation and walked away without allowing Caden to finish his apology. An Omega named Sarah, whom Caden had publicly humiliated for sport, refused to even be in the same room with him, her trauma so severe that his presence triggered panic attacks. These rejections wounded Caden in ways physical pain never had, each one a mirror, forcing him to see the monster he had been. He began to understand that redemption was not a destination he could reach through sufficient suffering or adequate apology. It was instead a direction he could choose to move in, knowing he might walk that path for the rest of his life without ever fully arriving at absolution. The realization was simultaneously crushing and liberating, destroying his ego while offering him purpose beyond mere survival. Lara watched his progress with guarded hope, ready to intercede if he backslid, but willing to give him space to stumble and recover. She spent her own days learning to master the celestial power that had awakened within her, training under guidance that came through meditation and connection with ancestral memories. The celestial wolves had left behind a legacy, not in written form, but encoded genetically, accessible to those who carried their blood and possessed the patience to listen. She learned to manipulate time in small ways, slowing or accelerating it within limited areas. She discovered she could heal almost any injury short of death, channeling lunar energy through her touch to knit flesh and restore function. Most unsettling, she found she possessed the ability to see threads of fate, potential futures branching from present choices, like roads diverging in a forest. This last ability proved both blessing and curse, showing her outcomes of decisions before they were made, but also revealing how easily the future could shift based on seemingly insignificant variables. She saw timelines where Caden completed his redemption and became a force for genuine positive change. She also saw futures where he reverted to type the moment her observation lapsed, where he rebuilt his empire of fear with even more sophisticated methods of control. The future was not fixed, and that uncertainty was terrifying for someone trying to navigate toward the best possible outcome. The attacks Damien had predicted began in the 6th month after Lara's awakening. Alpha Marcus Vane, ruler of the Crimson Moon Pack and a wolf whose reputation for brutality made Caden look restrained by comparison, led the first assault. He arrived with a war party of 50 wolves, all of them battle-hardened fighters loyal to the old ways and contemptuous of Lara's reforms. The attack came at dawn, time to catch Moonstone's defenders at their most vulnerable, and it succeeded in breaching the outer perimeter before resistance could organize. Vane himself targeted Lara directly, his strategy sound even if his understanding of her capabilities was fatally flawed. The battle that followed would be remembered as the Day the Moon Wept, a poetic name for what was in reality a brutal demonstration of celestial power unleashed without restraint. Lara met Vane's war party alone in the central compound, standing in the courtyard where Caden had once humiliated her, and when Vane demanded her surrender, she simply shook her head. "You have come seeking violence, Alpha Vane, and I will not deny you, but understand that what you begin today will end with you begging for the mercy you never showed others. Turn back now, and I will allow you and your wolves to leave with your lives and your dignity. Persist, and I will teach you why the Celestials were feared even by Alphas at the height of their power." Vane laughed, the sound ugly and devoid of humor, and gave the order to attack. His wolves surged forward like a crimson tide, claws extended and fangs bared, certain that numbers and ferocity would overcome whatever tricks this jumped-up Omega might possess. Lara closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and released the power she had been carefully restraining. The air itself seemed to crystallize around her, forming geometric patterns that pulsed with silver light. When the first wave of attackers reached her, they struck an invisible barrier and rebounded with bone-breaking force. Their momentum turned against them by defenses that operated according to laws of physics that did not apply in the mortal realm. The battlefield became a canvas painted in silver light and crimson blood, though notably the blood was never Lara's. She moved through Vane's warriors like wind through grass, her touch rendering them unconscious or paralyzed without inflicting permanent harm. It would have been easier to kill them, simpler to unleash destructive force that would have ended the battle in seconds. But she had promised herself she would not become the very thing she opposed, that she would not answer violence with unnecessary death if any alternative existed. When the last of Vane's warriors lay incapacitated on the courtyard stones, she approached the Alpha himself with an expression of profound sadness. Vane had watched his entire war party fall, without managing to harm their target, and the experience had shattered something fundamental in his worldview. He backed away from Lara's approach, his legendary confidence replaced by raw panic as he finally understood the magnitude of the mistake he had made. "Please," he whispered, and the words seemed to cost him everything. "Please, I was wrong. I should not have come. Let me go, and I swear I will never trouble you again." It was a complete capitulation. The proud alpha reduced to begging in less than an hour. If you're still watching, you're the real MVP. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell because you do not want to miss how this saga concludes. Drop a like if you think Lara should show mercy, or if you believe some crimes can't be forgiven. Lara stopped her advance but did not retreat. "I am going to let you go, Alpha Vane. Not because you deserve mercy, but because every wolf watching needs to understand that my goal is not vengeance. You will return to Crimson Moon territory, and you will tell your pack what happened here. You will explain that the old ways are ending, that alphas who rule through terror will face consequences they cannot fight or escape. And you will begin the same process of reflection and redemption that Caden Blackthorn is undertaking, or you will face me again under circumstances far less forgiving." She gestured, and the invisible force holding Vane in place released him. "Go, and carry with you the knowledge that you live today only because I chose mercy over justice." The aftermath of Vane's failed assault sent shockwaves through the Continental Packs. 3 more alphas who had been planning similar attacks immediately withdrew their war parties, pragmatism overcoming pride as they reassessed the cost of opposing Lara. The Alpha Council, watching from the sidelines, found itself in an increasingly untenable position. Some members argued for escalation, for uniting all loyal packs in a coordinated strike that would overwhelm even celestial power, through sheer numbers. Others advocated for accommodation, suggesting that Lara's reforms, while inconvenient, were not actually existential threats to Alpha authority, if implemented with sufficient flexibility. Damian Frost, caught between these factions, made a decision that would define his legacy. He broke ranks with the Council's hardliners and publicly endorsed Lara's reforms, using his considerable political capital to argue that adaptability was strength, and that clinging to corrupt systems in the face of inevitable change was the path of fools. His defection cost him allies and earned him enemies, but it also provided cover for other moderates to step forward and support the reform movement. Within weeks, the Alpha Council had fractured into 3 distinct factions: hardliners who would never accept change, moderates willing to negotiate, and a small but growing progressive wing that argued Lara had not gone far enough in her reforms. Caden, observing this political drama, from his position in the Omega Quarters, felt something he had not experienced in years. Hope. Not hope for his own redemption, which he had largely given up on achieving, but hope that perhaps the world his cruelty had helped create might actually transform into something better. He had been attending council meetings as an observer, his presence tolerated because Lara insisted he witness the debates about pack governance and alpha responsibility, listening to wolves argue about concepts like accountability and consent, watching as ideas he would have once dismissed as weakness were seriously debated, produced a cognitive dissonance that was actively painful. One evening, 9 months into his redemption arc, Caden found Lara meditating in the garden that had been planted on the former site of the pack's punishment cells. The symbolism was deliberate, replacing a space of pain with one of growth and beauty. He hesitated at the garden's edge, still uncertain of his welcome despite the months of coexistence. When Lara opened her eyes and gestured for him to enter, he approached with the caution of someone expecting rejection. "I have been thinking about purpose," Caden said without preamble, his voice rougher than usual from emotions he still struggled to articulate. "For most of my life, my purpose was accumulating and maintaining power. Every action, every relationship, every decision was calculated to enhance my dominance. Now that I have lost that power and come to understand how poisonous that purpose was, I find myself adrift. I do not know who Caden Blackthorn is supposed to be if he is not the most feared alpha on the continent. I do not know what I am meant to do with however many years remain to me." Lara considered him with those unsettling silver eyes that saw far more than surface appearance. Purpose is not something given to you by circumstance or claimed through conquest. It is something you choose and build through daily decisions to be better than you were yesterday. You spent decades creating suffering. Perhaps your purpose now is to spend whatever time you have remaining creating healing. You broke wolves and called it strength. Perhaps your purpose is to help build systems that nurture strength without requiring anyone to be broken. You lived as a cautionary tale about power unchecked by compassion. Perhaps your purpose is to become a different kind of story, one about transformation and the possibility of change. Caden absorbed this, turning her words over in his mind like a puzzle whose solution remained just out of reach. And if I fail? If I try to be better and discover that I am simply too damaged, too fundamentally broken by what I made myself into, what then? The vulnerability in his voice was raw, unfiltered by the bravado that had once characterized every word he spoke. Then you fail. Lara replied with a gentleness that somehow made the words sting more than cruelty would have. And you get up the next day, and you try again. That is what redemption looks like, Caden. Not a single grand gesture that washes away all sins, but 10,000 small choices to be kind when cruelty would be easier, to be patient when violence would be faster, to be humble when pride would be more comfortable. Some days you will succeed. Some days you will fall back into old patterns. The question is not whether you will be perfect, because you will not be. The question is whether you will keep trying despite imperfection. Whether you will keep choosing the harder right over the easier wrong, whether you will keep walking toward redemption, even knowing you might never fully arrive. They sat in silence for a long time after that, two souls damaged in different ways by the same sick system, both trying to find their way toward something better. The garden around them grew twilight shadows as the sun set, and in that dimming light, something shifted between them. Not forgiveness, which would have been premature and possibly false, but recognition, an acknowledgement that they were both struggling toward the same goal from different starting points, that perhaps their journeys, while distinct, were not entirely separate. The final confrontation came in the 12th month after Lara's awakening, right as the first anniversary approached. Alpha Gareth Stone, the Council's most vocal hardliner, and a wolf whose pack operated according to principles that made slavery look progressive, assembled a coalition of traditional alphas who refused to accept the new order. 50 packs, over 10,000 wolves, united under Stone's leadership with a single objective: eliminate Lara Winters and crush the reform movement before it spread further. It was the largest lupine military mobilization in over a century, an army that represented the last desperate stand of an order that could feel its death approaching. They arrived at Moonstone's borders on the anniversary of Lara's transformation. The symbolism, deliberate and the message clear. Stone himself led from the front. A massive wolf whose russet fur bore scars from 100 battles, and whose eyes held the fanaticism of someone who would rather die than compromise his beliefs. He carried with him artifacts claimed to nullify celestial power. Relics from the Great Purge when the original celestial wolves had been hunted to near extinction. Their existence suggested that this was not merely an attack, but an attempted genocide, an effort to ensure that no celestial blood would ever again threaten alpha supremacy. Lara met this army not in Moonstone territory, but in the neutral zone between packlands, a deliberate choice to avoid bringing destruction to the home she had been building. She was not alone. Damian Frost stood to her right with 50 of his finest warriors, the moderate alpha having finally committed fully to the reform cause. To her left stood Caden Blackthorn, stripped of his pack bond and alpha authority, but still a formidable fighter, having spent the past year retraining his skills toward protection rather than domination. Behind her, volunteers from a dozen packs who believed in the vision of a better lupine society prepared for the battle of their lives. Stone regarded this assembly with contempt, clearly visible in his expression. So the false prophet comes attended by traitors and weaklings. How appropriate that your final stand will be witnessed by those whose corruption you enabled. He raised one paw, and his army began to spread out, forming an encirclement that would allow no escape. We have come not merely to kill you, Winters, but to erase you. To ensure that when wolves speak of this day 100 years hence, they will remember only that the celestial bloodline died screaming, that their attempt to overturn natural order ended in failure so complete that none would dare repeat it. What followed was not a battle, but a cataclysm, a clash that rewrote the landscape and left scars. Visible from orbit, Lara unleashed power she had spent months learning to control, creating barriers of solid moonlight that turned aside the initial charge, summoning winds that carried the force of hurricanes to scatter Stone's formations. But the artifacts he carried proved partially effective, creating zones where her celestial abilities flickered and failed, where she was vulnerable to attacks that should have been impossible to land. A blade coated in residue from some ancient weapon cut. Across her shoulder, drawing divine blood that hissed and steamed where it touched mortal earth. Caden fought with a ferocity born of purpose rather than rage, his movements economical and precise as he protected Lara's flanks from wolves who sought to exploit her momentary weaknesses. Years of combat experience guided his actions, but now those skills served defense rather than conquest. He took wounds meant for others, used his body as a shield for the vulnerable, and in doing so discovered a truth that had eluded him throughout his previous life. There was more honor in protecting one life than in taking 1,000. The battle raged for hours, the tide shifting back and forth as both sides committed reserves and adapted tactics. Damien's warriors fought with the discipline of professional soldiers, their training evident in coordinated maneuvers that maximized effectiveness while minimizing casualties. The Reform Coalition's smaller numbers were offset by fighting for something beyond mere survival or alpha approval, a motivation that made each wolf worth 3 opponents. But Stone's army had fanaticism on their side, the zealots' willingness to die for beliefs they had never questioned, and fanaticism made them terrifyingly effective. When Lara and Stone finally met in personal combat, the earth itself seemed to hold its breath. The Alpha wielded a spear tipped with metal forged during the Great Purge, one of the weapons used to kill the original Celestials, and its touch burned even through her defenses. Stone was ancient, older than his appearance suggested, and his experience showed in movements that wasted no energy and left no openings. They circled each other like planets, locked in gravity's embrace, each seeking advantage, each aware that this duel would determine not just their own fates, but the future of Lupine society. "You fight well for a girl playing at divinity," Stone taunted, his voice carrying over the battlefield. "But you are young and soft, raised in an age that does not understand the necessity of cruelty. I was there when the last Celestials died. I was there when we burned their temples and salted their sacred groves. I know exactly how to kill you, and I will take such pleasure in being the one to ensure your bloodline dies with you." Lara dodged a thrust that would have pierced her heart, countering with a blast of pure energy that sent Stone tumbling backward. "You were there. You participated in genocide and called it necessity. You helped destroy beings whose only crime was holding Alphas accountable for their actions. And now you have the arrogance to stand before their last daughter and boast about murder as if it were achievement. You are exactly what I have been fighting against, Stone. You are the embodiment of everything wrong with Alpha culture, the living argument for why reform is not just desirable, but essential." Their clash intensified, power meeting power in explosions that left craters in the earth. Stone's artifact weapons proved effective, blocking or deflecting celestial energy that should have ended him instantly. But Lara had something he could not counter. She had spent a year learning not just to wield power, but to understand it, to see how energy flowed and where disruptions in that flow could be exploited. She began targeting not Stone himself, but the artifacts he carried, unraveling the ancient enchantments that made them effective against celestial abilities. One by one, his advantages failed him. The spear lost its ability to burn through her defenses, becoming merely an exceptionally well-crafted mundane weapon. The amulet that had been deflecting her attacks crumbled to dust, its magic exhausted beyond recovery. The armor woven with Purge-era wards unraveled like cheap cloth, leaving him suddenly vulnerable in ways he had not been since the battle's beginning. Stone realized what was happening too late, his confident expression transforming into genuine fear, as he understood he was about to lose not just this fight, but everything he had built his identity upon. Lara's final attack was not violent, but rather surgically precise, a lance of pure celestial energy that entered through Stone's chest and emerged from his back without leaving a physical wound. What it did leave was far more devastating. His alpha nature, that fundamental aspect of his being that had defined him for over 3 centuries, simply ceased to exist. The severance was instantaneous and complete, leaving him not dead, but reduced to a state no alpha feared more than death itself. Ordinary. He collapsed, not from pain, but from the sheer psychological shock of losing the core component of his identity. The battlefield fell silent as wolves on both sides witnessed their supposedly invincible leader brought low. Without Stone's fanaticism driving them forward, the coalition army's resolve crumbled. Wolves began surrendering by the dozen, then by the hundreds, until the entirety of Stone's force had laid down arms and submitted to Lara's judgment. The Battle of the Neutral Grounds, as it would come to be known, ended not with total victory for either side, but with a demonstration so profound that further resistance became unthinkable. Lara stood over Stone's prone form, her own injuries severe enough that blood ran freely from multiple wounds. "I could kill you. Every wolf here would call it justice, and none would question the righteousness of ending. Someone who participated in genocide and led 10,000 wolves to attack me. But I am not going to kill you, Alpha Stone. I am going to do something far more instructive. I am going to let you live as what you despised, as a wolf without power or authority, and I am going to ensure you spend whatever time remains to you, serving those you once ruled. Maybe, if you possess even a fraction of Caden Blackthorn's capacity for growth, you will learn something from this experience. Or maybe you will simply die bitter and unrepentant. Either way, your example will serve its purpose." The aftermath of the Battle of the Neutral Grounds transformed the political landscape of lupine North America. The Alpha Council formally dissolved, replaced by a new governing structure that included representatives from all pack levels and operated according to principles of accountability and consent rather than simple dominance. Dozens of alphas voluntarily stepped down, recognizing that they lacked the temperament or skills for leadership under the new paradigm. New alphas emerged, wolves who led through inspiration rather than intimidation, who viewed their position as responsibility rather than privilege. Caden, having proven himself through his actions during the battle and his year-long commitment to genuine change, was offered a position on the new council. He accepted, not as an alpha, but as an advocate for reform, bringing the perspective of someone who had perpetrated the old system's worst abuses and therefore understood intimately how such cycles could be broken. His presence was controversial, a constant reminder to victims of alpha tyranny that redemption was possible, but also a test of whether the new order could truly embody the mercy it preached. 3 years after Lara's awakening, Moonstone Pack had been rebuilt according to principles the original Celestials would have recognized. The hierarchy remained because structure was necessary for any society, but it was a hierarchy based on merit and service rather than intimidation and birthright. Omegas worked alongside Alphas in council deliberations, their perspectives valued rather than dismissed. Pups grew up learning that strength meant protecting others rather than dominating them, that leadership was earned through character rather than claimed through violence. Lara herself had become something unprecedented in modern lupine society. Not an alpha who ruled, but a guardian who watched. She traveled between packs, offering guidance when requested, intervening when abuses came to her attention, and generally serving as the conscience and accountability that the Celestials had always represented. It was exhausting work that left little time for personal life, but it was work that mattered in ways that made the sacrifice worthwhile. One evening, she found Caden in that same garden where they had shared conversation about purpose years earlier. He had aged visibly, the stress of redemption, and the wounds from the great battle, leaving their marks despite supernatural healing. But there was peace in his features now, a contentment that had been absent during all his years of alpha dominance. They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the moon rise over territory that bore little resemblance to the fear-ridden packlands Lara had first entered. "Do you ever regret it?" Caden asked eventually, his voice soft in the gathering darkness. "Revealing yourself, upending everything, taking on responsibility for reforming an entire species' culture. You could have walked away after awakening. could have used your power to find some isolated territory where you would never be bothered. Instead, you chose the hardest possible path. Do you ever wish you had made a different choice? Lara considered the question, with the seriousness it deserved. Every day, she admitted finally, there are moments when I am exhausted beyond words, when dealing with another petty tyrant or resolving another pack dispute seems more than I can bear. Moments when I think about how much easier my life would be if I had simply turned away from all of this. But then I remember Thomas, that terrified pup whose screams drew me to reveal myself. I remember the Omega quarters where wolves lived in constant fear. I remember your face when you realized that cruelty had consequences after all. And I know that whatever price I pay for this work, it is worth paying because the alternative is unconscionable. Caden nodded slowly, accepting her answer without argument. For what it is worth, I am grateful. Not just for the mercy you showed me personally, though I am grateful for that as well, but for forcing me to see what I had become, for refusing to let me continue down a path that would have ended with me dying alone and hated, leaving behind nothing but pain and fear. You gave me the chance to become something better than the monster I was. Whatever redemption I have achieved, whatever good I might do going forward, exists only because you were willing to believe change was possible even for wolves like me. They sat together until the moon reached its zenith, two souls scarred by different traumas, but united in purpose, watching over a pack that represented hope for what Lupine society might become. It was not a perfect ending, because real life rarely provides such things. Challenges remained. Some alphas still clung to old ways in territories beyond Lara's immediate reach. Omegas still suffered abuses that would take generations to fully address. But it was a beginning, a foundation upon which something better could be built. And in that garden where punishment cells had once stood, surrounded by flowers that bloomed even in autumn's chill, Lara Winters allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. The sky that had once split to reveal her true nature remained whole above them, but the world beneath it had cracked open in ways that mattered far more. She had not saved everyone. She had not fixed everything, but she had changed enough that hope was no longer a foolish sentiment, but a reasonable expectation. The work would continue tomorrow, and all the tomorrows after that. But tonight, under the moon that had always watched over her kind, Lara rested. If you made it to the end of this journey, thank you for watching. What did you think about Lara's choices and Caden's redemption arc? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoyed this story, show some love by hitting that like button and subscribing for more supernatural romance content. Until next time, may your own transformations be as profound as the ones we witnessed here today.